Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. So my goal here today is to talk a little bit about, obviously to talk about implementation science. And I think you've all been hearing about specific projects that talk about implementation and implementing innovative programs and evidence-based interventions. And what I want to do with my time is to maybe take a step back and sort of formalize some of those things and hopefully demystify some of the things you've been hearing about as it relates to implementation science, and really kind of talk about what I think are some of the opportunities for applying implementation science to disability health. So before doing that, I should first describe myself. I am a white male with blue eyes, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark but rapidly graying hair, and hair that is rapidly declining in volume, as my daughter frequently tells me. Also, before I get into my remarks, the introduction mentioned some of my funding. I don't have a slide on specific disclosures, just to acknowledge that I do receive funding from the National Institutes of Health, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, none of which present a financial conflict of interest with what I'm going to be talking about here today. So just to maybe start out, I think what it would be good is to define what we mean by implementation science. And again, you've heard a lot of specific projects throughout the last day and a half. And what I want to do here is just kind of maybe elaborate on what Dr. Graham was talking about. He talked about the evidence to practice gap. And where I think it helps to start is to think about effectiveness research. So on this slide to the right, we have sort of a definition of effectiveness research, which really refers to the generation of evidence that is used to establish whether some new therapy, some new medication, some new program is effective at improving some clinical outcome of interest that we care about, right? This is also known as intervention research. Some of you may know it as comparative effectiveness research. And this is really kind of what we use to determine whether we should be doing something, whether we should be doing something different from a caregiving perspective. And again, this is usually where that process begins, when this is where we focus our attention on things like clinical outcomes and identifying or developing evidence-based interventions. So that's the evidence side of that evidence to practice gap. From there, we move to sort of the middle part of this figure, where we take purposeful actions to try to sort of get that evidence-based intervention into routine use. How do we get providers, clinicians, or patients to actually use this thing? And this is the sort of known as implementation practice. Then, after that, where we typically put our attention is on actually developing approaches or strategies to enable clinicians and other people to use those evidence-based interventions and integrate them into their care practices, their care routines on a routine basis. And that is what we refer to as implementation research or implementation science. Why do we care about implementation science? Well, we know that roughly half of all evidence-based practices actually make it into routine use. So we spend a lot of time, we spend a lot of money developing all these wonderful new therapies and new programs, yet they oftentimes sit on the shelf and don't get used. For those that do actually make it into routine care, it takes an incredibly long time. Some estimates put that between 15 to 20 years before things that get developed actually begin to get used on a routine basis. So many of these programs either don't get used, again, or take a really long time. We also know that the science is not enough. Historical models would be where we would go out, present a paper in a peer-reviewed journal, maybe go to a conference and hope that people would start using it because they happen to be at that conference. Those kinds of passive approaches to getting people to change behaviors do not work. We know that there are a lot of different organizational and social barriers that we need to attend to to actually get evidence-based interventions into routine use. And I think with some of the talks earlier mentioned this idea of de-implementation. The evidence changes, new programs, new therapies are developed, and so there's sort of this need to kind of change what you do and stop doing things that we know are no longer effective. So I think when I think about applying some of these ideas to disability health research, there are a few different areas that implementation science can be helpful. And one of the first places is this question of how can we develop evidence-based interventions that can be embedded in organizations. So a lot of time, in a lot of the talks you heard today, was about how to include people, include different stakeholders in that development process to ensure that interventions are developed with end users in mind. Another place where implementation science is helpful in addressing disability-focused implementation science questions is what kinds of strategies are best suited to implement disability-focused interventions. So we have this large sort of growing list of strategies that are available to help support the implementation of evidence-based interventions into routine care. One shortcoming is that they oftentimes are not evidence-based. We have a lot of progress to be made in actually showing that these strategies are effective at improving the uptake of evidence-based interventions. But more importantly, I think what we need to be thinking about is whether those same strategies apply the same way when focused on disability-related interventions, because I don't think we've done enough work in that area. And then last, how can we actually develop or adapt effective interventions to fit the circumstances of people living with disabilities? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I know you've heard some other talks, including the talk by Dr. Tapan Mehta yesterday talking about NCPAD Connect. But I do want to sort of highlight there's a few ways that we are applying some of these implementation science concepts to NCPAD to understand how well we're doing at implementing the different parts of NCPAD and opportunities for improving NCPAD moving forward so that we can maximize the reach and impact of NCPAD. So on one part of what we call sort of these different areas or strategies is the health promotion and wellness programs. The flagship, which is Mentor, but Dr. Robin Lanzi will be talking about another one of those programs next, the growth program, but there's this whole suite or portfolio of health and wellness programs. So part of our evaluation efforts are focusing on those programs. You heard yesterday from Dr. Mehta this idea about this new part of NCPAD, which is trying to expand the reach by integrating into kind of the healthcare delivery space and being able to improve our reach by doing screenings and referrals amongst healthcare providers, namely right now with federally qualified health centers. And then last, we have this strategy focused on building capacity to provide programs in local communities. So I'm going to just quickly again highlight a couple of sort of prominent frameworks that are often used in implementation science. One is known as the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which we are using in our evaluation efforts, and the REAIM framework, which stands for Reach, Effectiveness, Adoption, Implementation, and Maintenance. And just to kind of briefly show you how we're using these, we went out and did a bunch of semi-structured interviews with partner organizations to help us understand how well our efforts are to integrate or to implement this referral and recruitment process in partner organizations was working. So here are some of the things we heard. I don't know how many of my patients actually enroll. It would be helpful to have some of those numbers. So a lot of things that we heard is that there are gaps. They're not hearing enough about how well their participants are working through and kind of matriculating through that referral and recruitment process. Likewise, we're hearing from partner organizations that the process is complicated and time-consuming. So we're using some of these findings from our interviews to refine that first strategy that Dr. Mehta talked about yesterday so that we can actually make this more efficient and less confusing for participants. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on REAIM, just to show you that the This is a really flexible approach, a strategy for our framework for helping us use a common set of metrics across different types of parts of the NCPAD program, right? So you can see here we have different ways of operationalizing REACH, but we can actually look across the different parts of NCPAD and understand how effective are our approaches at reaching different participants or people who may benefit from NCPAD. The last thing, and I want to talk about with my remaining time, is really kind of, again, talking about what I think are some of the promises and the challenges to using implementation science to ask and answer questions related to disability health. First, as I mentioned before, when talking about some of the frameworks, implementation science, I believe, provides a really kind of, one of the reasons it's promising is it provides this systematic approach for understanding how to best support the development, adoption, and sort of sustained use of many of the interventions and programs that you've been hearing about over the last couple of days, whether it's telehealth or the implementation planning program that Dr. Graham was talking about. This is one of the great benefits of implementation science. The other advantage of implementation science is that it explicitly recognizes and tries to integrate the role of different community and contextual circumstances, in this case of people that are living with disabilities. And this is something that implementation science does particularly well. You heard this in Dr. Graham's remarks, this idea that taking a really kind of a sort of a community-based, user-centered design to make sure those voices are heard when developing this implementation planning process. And again, this is something that implementation science really takes to heart. And one of the final things I'll note is that most implementation science really takes this interdisciplinary approach to leverage kind of the complementary strengths of different kind of disciplinary areas and paradigms. Now, that's not to say that everything is perfect with implementation science and there aren't challenges. The reality of most applications and most people is that they're facing a lot of different co-occurring conditions. It's really difficult to sort of say, I only have diabetes, or I only have heart failure. So the challenge is sort of designing and implementing interventions that can reflect those co-occurring and comorbid conditions, which typically will demand multiple kinds of evidence-based interventions. And most approaches to implementation science have really tried to isolate just one of those interventions and really have failed to kind of incorporate those more complex scenarios that I think most people are living with. We also know that the evidence evolves, as I mentioned before, so there's this sort of constant need to adopt or adapt interventions, which from an adopter standpoint, the organization that's adopting can be really challenging if you're constantly on this cycle of reassessing what's new, as well as how do you sort of integrate that and discard what you know that is now no longer sort of evidence-based. And the last thing I'll mention is that it can be difficult to establish what I think is a kind of a harmonious balance between research and implementation. And I think this was mentioned in some of the earlier talks today. There's oftentimes a sort of this drive to implement. We all want to sort of get things into practice. We want to sort of take action, and we don't want to sort of think through and be thoughtful and planful about how we're going to actually implement and evaluate these interventions. So there's this tension in the sense between speed and rigor for those of us who are responsible for either implementing and or evaluating these efforts to implement evidence-based interventions. I will conclude there and open it up to any questions.